You've seen this logo. For over 2 decades, it's been the stamp of hip-hop royalty. An empire built by Dr. Dre that gave us global superstars like Eminem, 50 Cent, and Kendrick Lamar. It's a brand that means groundbreaking music and billions of dollars. But what if I told you that the name itself, Aftermath, the very foundation of this empire, was already taken by a thrash metal band from Chicago? This is the unbelievable and almost forgotten story of how a band that legally owned and built a brand around a name for a decade got dragged into a legal war that they could never win. It's a battle that would not only cost them their name, but it would end up overshadowing their music, their career, and their entire legacy. Before we get started, be sure to hit the bell notification icon and put all notifications on. I hear from a lot of my subscribers that they don't even get notifications when I post my videos. Our story doesn't start on the sun-drenched streets of Compton, but in the gritty industrial landscape of Chicago. Back in October of 1985, this is where three high school buddies, Kyriakos Cholis, who went by the name Charlie, a guitarist named Steve Sacco, and a drummer named Ray Schmidt, decided to start a band. They weren't just some kids messing around with guitars and drums. They wanted to build a new aggressive sound. At a time when thrash metal was just exploding with bands pushing the limits of speed and aggression, Charlie, Steve, and Ray wanted to do something very different. They wanted to be faster, they wanted to be more technical and more complex than anybody else out there. They called themselves Aftermath, and the name was perfect. It just captured the bleak post-apocalyptic vibe of their music, and this feeling of a world just reeling from chaos. Back in the mid-80s, the Chicago metal scene was this melting pot of creativity, and Aftermath carved out their own territory pretty fast. They got a bassist, and they started creating a sound that was blistering, a mix of hardcore punk's raw energy and thrash metal's technical skill. It was a sound that would later get labeled crossover thrash, and they were right there from the beginning. They were young, they were ambitious, and they felt like they were sitting on the verge of something huge. For them, the name Aftermath wasn't just some cool word. It was their identity, it was their flag that they were about to plant in the music world. Through just sheer force of will, Aftermath started building their reputation from the ground up. In 1986, they dropped their first demo, Sentenced to Death. They sent out about 100 copies on cassette tapes, a pretty humble start, but it sent shockwaves through the local scene. But it was their 1987 demo, Killing the Future, that really put them on the map. With tracks like When You Will Die and War for Freedom, the demo was a total statement of their intent. It was mind-bendingly fast, technically insane, and it got them noticed way outside of Chicago. Big-time publications like Metal Hammer and Kerrang started featuring the band. Britain's Metal Forces magazine, a giant in the genre, even put two of their tracks on a compilation LP called Demolition: Scream Your Brains Out. This was a massive seal of approval, and all of a sudden this band from Chicago was sharing vinyl space with other rising stars from all over the world, and their music was reaching the ears of metal fans everywhere. It was even by 1990, Kerrang had even named their demo, Words That Echo Fear, as one of the top 10 demos of the whole year. So for a solid decade, if you were a fan of aggressive, forward-thinking metal, the name Aftermath meant this band. They had poured thousands of hours and countless dollars into building their brand. They printed merch, they played shows, and they tirelessly promoted their name. The word was theirs. They had earned it through sweat, ambition, and just raw musical talent. The future looked bright, and it seemed inevitable that Aftermath was on the path to becoming a major force. They were a band with a history, a dedicated fan base, and a name that was getting international recognition. Now, unfortunately, you can probably figure out where I'm going with this. They were also on a collision course with one of the most powerful people in the entire music industry. By the early 90s, Aftermath was set to release their masterpiece. They had sharpened their skills, perfected their complex songs, and written an album they believed would cement their place in the metal world. That album was called Eyes of Tomorrow. It was this work of staggering ambition, a masterpiece of what was becoming known as technical or progressive thrash metal. The music was so intricate with all these shifting time signatures and atmospheric parts that really set them apart. But the journey to release it was just plagued with bad luck. In 1990, the major metal label Road Racer Records approached them, but the negotiations fell apart. Then they got signed to a smaller New York label called Big Chief Records, But disaster struck right in the middle of recording when the label suddenly went under. Left in limbo, the band had to finish recording the album by paying for all the studio time themselves, and it nearly made them broke. After 4 long frustrating years, Eyes of Tomorrow was finally issued in 1994 on the band's own independent label. The album was a trailblazer, but it had tragically missed its moment. By 1994, the music world had completely changed. The raw, aggressive energy of thrash metal had been almost totally wiped out by the introspective, flannel-wearing angst of grunge. Bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam were all over the radio, and the complex technical fury of a band like Aftermath felt like it was from another time period. The album that should have been their crowning achievement was met with praise from critics who were in the know, but it was pretty much ignored by the mainstream music press. They'd created a defining work for their genre only to find that the genre itself had been pushed back underground. The band was left reeling, facing an industry that didn't seem to want what they were offering anymore. It was a tough blow, but it was nothing compared to the storm that was about to hit them from the West Coast. While Aftermath was struggling to find their place in the new musical landscape, a seismic shift was happening in the world of hip-hop. In March of 1996, Dr. Dre, one of the most influential producers on the planet, made a shocking announcement. He was leaving Death Row Records, the notorious and massively successful label that he had co-founded with Suge Knight. Dre's departure was the end result of months of rising tension over the company's creative direction and just growing concerns about Suge's volatile and dangerous behavior. Having been a part of NWA Straight Outta Compton and of course putting out his own masterpiece, The Chronic, Dre was a cultural giant. His move sent shockwaves through the industry. He was starting a new label, a boutique venture through Interscope Records that would focus on quality over quantity. He needed a name for this new empire, something that would signal a clean break from all the chaos of Death Row and the start of a new chapter. He wanted a name that communicated he had survived the drama and was now moving on. He chose the name Aftermath Entertainment, and it wasn't until later in the process that his legal team did trademark search that they finally came across the metal band Aftermath from Chicago. Whether it was an oversight or they just didn't care, it didn't matter. Dre was backed up by immense power and deep pockets of Interscope Records, and he had decided on a name, and that's what he was going to use. And a thrash band from Chicago was now standing directly in his way. The stage was set for a classic David versus Goliath battle, one that would play out not on the stage, but in the cold, unforgiving world of corporate law. Back in Chicago, Charlie and his bandmates were completely unaware of what was going down in the boardrooms of LA. For them, life was just this frustrating cycle of trying to promote an album in a market that had moved on. Then the phone rang. On the other end of the line was a lawyer representing Dr. Dre and Interscope Records, and the lawyer was pretty direct. A new record label was being formed, and they wanted to use the name Aftermath. Now, according to court documents, the attorney's first pitch was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. He described how the new venture is a small R&B label and made no mention of the fact that it was being founded by Dr. Dre. Then came the offer. They were prepared to pay Charlie a flat fee of $5,000 for the rights to the name. $5,000 for a name that Aftermath had spent nearly a decade building. A name that was on their demos, their album, their merchandise, a name that was, for all intents and purposes, their entire identity. It was a laughably low offer, basically an attempt to swat them away like a fly. Charlie, who had registered a trademark on the name Aftermath, refused. He understood the value of what he had built. He knew that a brand was more than just a word. It was a decade of his life's work. The first conversation ended in a stalemate. The band had drawn a line in the sand, but they were about to find out when you're dealing with a corporate giant, a simple no is usually never the end of the story. It's usually the beginning of the fight. After the initial lowball offer got shot down, Dr. Dre's legal team then offered $50,000, but that also got shot down by the band. Faced with an industry titan who was now openly using their trademark name, the band Aftermath had no choice but to escalate the matter. They decided to fight for their identity the only way they could. They took Dr. Dre to court. Charlie and company filed a lawsuit in their home turf of Illinois in October of 1996. The lawsuit listed Interscope Records, Aftermath Entertainment, and Andre Young, also known as Dr. Dre, as the defendants. Their legal case laid out a pretty clear argument for trademark infringement and unfair competition. The logic was simple. The band Aftermath had been using the name since 1985, they'd released music under that name, and they owned the registered trademark. They argued that Dr. Dre's use of the same name for for his record label was causing confusion in the market and was damaging the brand they'd spent over a decade building. They weren't just fighting for a word, they were fighting for the right to not be erased. They asked for a preliminary injunction to stop Dre from using the name while the case was being decided. The band was gambling everything on the belief that the legal system would protect their rights no matter how big and powerful their opponent was. They were about to step into an arena far more brutal than any mosh pit, a world of depositions, motions, and endless legal bills that would test their resolve and ultimately break them. The court case wasn't some dramatic one-day showdown you see in the movies or TV shows. Instead, it became a slow grinding war of attrition, a classic strategy that big corporations use against smaller opponents. Dr. Dre and Interscope had a team of high-powered attorneys, and more importantly, the money to drag the process out forever. For the members of Aftermath, the lawsuit became the soul-crushing second job. The lawsuit ate up their time and, more importantly, their creative energy. Instead of writing new songs or planning tours, their lives were now being dominated by legal strategy and the constant stress of the court battle. The very thing they were fighting for, their identity as a band, was being worn down by the fight itself. The whole conflict just created this toxic cloud that hung over everything they did.
Hi, I'm Kurt Loder with an MTV News Brief. The future of Dr. Dre's proposed name for his new record label, Aftermath, will be decided in a Chicago courtroom on Wednesday. It seems a local band called Aftermath, which has been around for nearly a decade, says Dre's people asked permission to use the name in June, but that the group turned him down, and it wants Dre ordered to use another name.
The court's initial ruling in November of 1996 was a devastating blow. The judge denied the band's request for that preliminary injunction, which would have stopped Dr. Dre from using the name immediately. The judge's reasoning was that the two groups operated in such different musical genres, thrash metal versus hip-hop, that the risk of anyone getting confused was low. He also pointed out that Dre's choice of the name was likely tied to his public exit from death row, rather than a deliberate attempt to piggyback on the metal band's fame. While the case could still go to a full trial, this initial decision allowed Dre's empire to continue its launch without any problems. Aftermath Entertainment released its first album, Dr. Dre Presents The Aftermath, that very same month, cementing the name in the public's mind as Dre's brand. That denial of the preliminary injunction was really the beginning of the end. With Dr. Dre's label now legally free to operate and release music under the Aftermath name, while the case just crawled through the system, the band faced a grim reality. The joy of making music had been replaced by the anxiety and bitterness of the lawsuit. The conflict had become the band's entire identity, overshadowing the very music that they were trying to protect. But things didn't end there. In an effort to stop the band from appealing the ruling and going to trial, Dr. Dre's people came to Aftermath with a new deal, one that on the surface looked a lot more generous. This time, they weren't just offering cash, they were offering a record deal. The deal was reportedly worth $20,000. Now, to an outsider, this might have looked like a golden ticket. A major label backed by one of music's biggest names was offering a contract. And for a struggling band in a dying genre, it could have been a lifeline. But Charlie saw it exactly for what it was. He later called the offer a sham. It wasn't a genuine offer to build their career or a partnership to develop their music. It was a thinly veiled attempt to buy their identity. They weren't being offered a future, they were being offered hush money. Well, Charlie and company ended up taking the offer, but not before Aftermath broke up in 1996. It wasn't some dramatic onstage implosion, but a quiet surrender. The combined weight of the lawsuit and the tough musical landscape of the mid-90s had just become too much to handle. It cost them their future. It had poisoned the well of their creativity, making it impossible to move forward as a band they had been for over a decade. The core members of Aftermath soon changed their name to Mother God Movie Star, which also allowed them to explore new musical styles without the shadow of the lawsuit hanging over their heads. They were finally free from the name that had become a curse, and they now had a label deal with Interscope. Interscope issued Mother God Movie Star's debut album in 1998. It was a lot more electro-metal influenced. Interscope gave the group some touring money, some money to shoot music videos, and agreed to print about 20,000 copies of their record. But it was following the tour for the album, which barely made a dent, the band called it quits and they soon lost their contract. Meanwhile, Aftermath Entertainment was doing the exact opposite. It was building a global empire on that very name. After a kind of lukewarm start with its first compilation album, the label struck gold in 1998. Dr. Dre signed a brash, incredibly talented rapper from Detroit named Eminem. The next year, Eminem's The Slim Shady LP came out, and became a cultural and commercial phenomenon. This was followed by the signing of 50 Cent in 2002, whose debut album Get Rich or Die Trying became another multi-platinum smash hit. The name Aftermath was now synonymous with hip-hop royalty, with a roster of artists who were defining the sound of the new millennium. For the millions of fans buying these records, the name had only one meaning. The thrash metal band from Chicago, the original owners of the name, had been almost completely written out of history. Their story became a piece of obscure music trivia, a forgotten casualty in the rise of a global entertainment brand. The irony was brutal. For Dr. Dre, the name Aftermath signified a prosperous new beginning. For the band that created it, it was the definitive end, or so it seemed. For almost 2 decades, the story of Aftermath stayed buried, just a piece of forgotten history. But the internet has a long memory. In 2015, celebrating 30 years since they first formed, the band announced they were reforming. The new wave of interest in classic thrash metal, fueled by a new generation of fans discovering music online, created a chance for them to reclaim their story. They began playing festivals, including one in their hometown of Chicago, and their classic material was remastered and reissued by labels who gave it the presentation it always deserved. The reissue of Eyes of Tomorrow was a huge moment, allowing fans, old and new, to really appreciate the album's technical brilliance. Today, the band is active once again, even releasing new music like their 2023 album, No Time to Waste. As of this year, they are working on new music. They're no longer defined just by the lawsuit. They're reclaiming their identity through one thing that was always truly theirs, their music. That brings us to the end of today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in Rock Roll Your Stories. Take care.